Silas Reed saw the two women just before sundown, standing where no one should have been standing in weather like that. The first was upright only because she had locked both knees. The second was on the ground beneath a juniper. Her fingers blew around the edge of a torn blanket. Snow moved sideways across the Arizona trail, thin as sand and sharp as ground glass. Silas reined in his chestnut gelding. Then he saw what the older woman was holding, a brass freight tag. Stamped into it were two characters he had not seen in 3 years. R17, that was the number of the wagon his younger brother had vanished with. The woman closed her fist around the tag as if she had caught him staring at a wound. Silas could have asked where she found it. He could have demanded answers. He could have turned his horse toward the warmth of his cabin and left the mystery in the snow. Instead, he dismounted, placed his rifle on the ground, and opened both hands. "Come with me," he said. The women did not move. Silas pointed toward the dark ridge behind him. "My ranch is beyond that rise. There's a stove, food, a room with a door you can lock from the inside." The older woman watched his face for a long time. She was Apache, perhaps in her early 30s, with wind-burned cheeks and a woven blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. The younger woman beside her looked barely old enough to have buried a husband, yet grief had already put years around her eyes. Silas did not know their names. He did not know why they had been driven into a winter storm, and he did not know that the brass tag in the older woman's hand was the first piece of a truth that would either give all three of them a home or take one away forever. The older woman was called Tala. The younger was Mina. Only 4 days earlier they had lived in a small Apache camp near the White Mountains, where winter settled hard in the high country and every sack of flour mattered. Tala's husband and Mina's husband had both worked as guides along the agency freight road. They knew the washes, the passes, and the places where wagon wheels could disappear overnight beneath sudden water. In late autumn, a government supply shipment had failed to reach the camp. 32 sacks of flour were missing. 12 barrels of salt pork, more than 200 wool blankets promised before the first deep freeze. Those numbers were not marks on paper to the people waiting for them. They were meals, warmth, children sleeping without shaking. The contractor responsible for the shipment, Harlan Voss, blamed raiders. Then his interpreter produced a letter. According to the translation read before the council, Tala's husband and Mina's husband had taken money from the raiders, shown them the freight road, and fled when the wagons were attacked. 3 days later, both men were found dead in a canyon. No money was found. No stolen food was found. But fear does not always wait for proof. Winter was closing in. Families were angry. The council had to decide whether 2 dead men had betrayed them, and Voss's interpreter swore the letter carried one husband's mark. Tala called it a lie. Mina begged them to let her see the original. They were refused. A few voices argued for patience. Others warned that keeping the widows in camp would invite more conflict with the agency. By sunset, grief had become suspicion, and suspicion had become an order. They were told to leave until the matter was settled. No escort was offered. No destination was named. They were given 1 blanket each, a small pouch of parched corn, and the silence of people too ashamed or too frightened to look them in the face. On the second night, the corn ran out. On the third morning, Mina's moccasins split at the heel. By the 4th afternoon, Tala had stopped telling her they would reach shelter soon, because each time she said it, the lie became harder to carry. The brass tag was the only hard thing Tala had kept from her husband's body. It had been clenched in his hand when they found him, R17. She did not know what it meant. Silas did. That was why, as he helped Mina onto his horse and wrapped his own coat around her, he felt an old fear waking beneath his ribs. 3 years earlier, his brother Elias had driven freight for Harlan Voss. Elias had left Silas's ranch with wagon R17 and never returned. Voss claimed the wagon had been lost in a flash flood. No wreck was found. No body was recovered. Silas had spent 2 months searching canyons and riverbeds before he finally stopped. He had told himself that the territory swallowed men every week. He had never believed it. Silas's ranch sat in a shallow valley behind a stand of juniper and pinon, far enough from the main road that most travelers missed it. The place had once been a stage stop called Reed Gate, though the sign above the corral had lost half its letters. There was a cabin, a stable, a dry well that worked only when it felt generous, and 40 acres of stubborn ground. When they reached the yard, Silas opened the cabin door and stepped aside. Tala remained on the threshold. Her eyes moved over the room: iron stove, rough table, 2 chairs, 1 narrow hallway. She measured the windows. She counted the exits. She noticed the rifle hooks on the wall. Silas saw her doing it. "My room is in the loft," he said. "The back room is yours. The lock works." Tala looked at the door. Silas remembered something his mother used to say when he and Elias were boys. "A roof keeps out the weather. A door tells you what kind of people live under it." He handed Tala the key. "Lock it if you need to." That first night the women ate slowly. Bean stew, cornbread, and coffee weakened with hot water because Silas had been stretching the grounds for weeks. Mina fell asleep sitting upright near the stove. Tala did not. She kept the brass tag in her palm and watched Silas as if every kindness might be a rope with a loop hidden at the end. Silas understood more than she knew. He had once trusted Harlan Voss because Voss wore polished boots and spoke like a man who kept records. Elias had trusted him too. That trust had ended with an empty road and a missing wagon. Silas wanted to ask about R-17. He did not yet. For the first several days the ranch moved around silence. Silas rose before dawn, fed the horses, split wood, and left food warming on the stove. Tala helped without asking permission. Mina watched closely, learning the rhythm of the place. They did not speak much English. Silas knew only a few Apache words, most of them badly pronounced from years trading horses. Their conversations began with gestures, objects, and patience. A bucket lifted meant water. 2 fingers toward the stable meant horses. A hand over the stove meant hot. A palm held flat meant enough. By the end of the first week, they had built a language from small things. Mina repaired her moccasin with rawhide and then mended a torn cinch Silas had been planning to throw away. Tala walked the fence line and found a seep beneath the north slope where the ground had not frozen. Silas had lived there 7 years and never noticed it. She dug a narrow channel with a broken shovel. By afternoon, water was running toward the lower trough. Silas stood watching it, half impressed and half embarrassed. Tala looked at him, pointed to the moving water, and said one English word, "Listen." It was the first time he saw the edge of a smile on her face. A week later, a young mare tore loose during a sleet storm. Silas went after her with a rope, but the mare was wild-eyed and striking. Tala stepped into the corral without a rope at all. She lowered her shoulders, turned slightly away, and waited. The mare circled once, twice, then came to her. Silas had spent years forcing frightened animals to understand him. Tala seemed to understand that fear listened better when it was not cornered. That night he found an extra bowl on the table before he asked for one. The ranch began changing in ways too small to notice day by day. The back room stopped looking like a storeroom. Mina hung dried herbs from a beam. Tala scrubbed soot from the window until morning light reached the floor. Silas repaired the broken latch on the kitchen cupboard because Mina had begun putting things there worth protecting. There was bread more often. The horses were calmer. Someone laughed at supper, and the sound startled all 3 of them. Silas had been alone so long that companionship felt almost like trespassing. His wife, Ruth, had died 8 winters earlier from fever. Their infant daughter lived only 2 days longer. After that, Elias had been the one person who could still walk into the cabin without knocking. Then Elias disappeared. Silas never replaced the second chair after it broke. He never saw a reason. Now Mina sat on an upturned crate. Tala used the chair nearest the stove, and Silas began wondering why he had accepted a table built for 2 when the room was clearly asking for 3. Still, the brass tag remained between them. Tala kept it inside a leather pouch at her throat. Sometimes Silas caught sight of it when she bent over the trough or reached for firewood. Each time he felt the same question: "Where did your husband get my brother's wagon tag?" Each time, he swallowed it. He told himself he was giving the women time. The truth was simpler. He was afraid of the answer. The first real break came from a sack of flour. Near the end of January, Silas rode to a trading post for salt, lamp oil, and seed. He returned after dark with fewer supplies than he had hoped and worse news than he wanted. Harlan Voss had been appointed temporary freight supervisor for the district. His company would control the spring deliveries. When Silas said the name, Tala dropped a wooden spoon. Mina stared at her. Silas slowly removed his gloves. "You know him," Tala answered in careful English. His man read the letter. "His interpreter?" She nodded. Silas pulled a chair from the table and sat. "My brother worked for Voss." The room went still. Tala's hand moved toward the pouch at her throat. Silas pointed to it. "That tag, R-17. It was fixed to my brother's wagon." Mina stepped back from him. Tala did not. "Your brother take food?" The question struck harder than an accusation because Silas had asked it himself for 3 years. I don't know. Tala's face closed. Silas could have lied. He could have defended Elias with the certainty of blood. Instead, he said the only honest thing. I know my brother was careless, proud, he owed money, but I never knew him to let hungry people freeze. Tala removed the brass tag and placed it on the table. My husband had this when he died. Silas touched it with one finger. The metal was scratched near the hole as if ripped from a chain or nailed board. Where was he found? Tala described a narrow canyon east of an abandoned copper trail. Silas knew it. A freight wagon could leave the agency road there and reach the mining camps without passing a single checkpoint. Something cold moved through him. Harlan Voss had not lost the shipment. He had moved it. But suspicion was not proof, and on the frontier men like Voss survived by making sure the truth arrived without a witness. Silas asked Tala whether her husband had left anything else. She shook her head. Mina looked down at the floor. Tala noticed. The two women exchanged words too fast for Silas to follow. Mina resisted. Tala pressed. Finally, Mina reached inside the lining of her blanket and pulled out a small iron key. Her husband had sewn it there before he left on his final trip. She had hidden it from the council because she did not know what it opened. Silas stared at the key. It was the kind used on freight chests. The next morning they searched the ranch. Silas checked the stable loft, the tack room, the dry well, the old stage office, and every chest Elias had left behind. The key fit nothing. For 3 days the search gave them purpose. On the 4th it gave them fear. Mina was sweeping the barn when the broom struck a loose plank beneath a pile of harness leather. The sound was hollow. Silas pried up the board. Under it sat a narrow freight box wrapped in oilcloth. On the lid, almost erased by dirt, was the burned mark of Voss Freight Company. Mina's key turned once. The lock opened. Inside were 6 government flour seals, a packet of delivery receipts, and a black ledger swollen from damp. Silas lifted the ledger with both hands. The first pages listed ordinary freight, tools, lamp oil, mail, seed. Then the entries changed. 32 sacks of flour diverted to Copper Ridge. 12 barrels of pork sold for cash. 216 blankets transferred to a private buyer. The dates matched the missing winter shipment. Beside each entry was Silas Reed's signature. Tala looked at Silas. The trust they had built did not break loudly. It simply left her face. Mina stepped closer to Tala, placing herself on the same side of the table. Silas turned pages too quickly, searching for something that would make the handwriting belong to another man. But he knew the slant of Elias's R. He knew the impatient line through the final D. His brother had signed every page. Tala pointed at the ledger. Your house, then at Silas, your brother, then at the brass tag, my husband dead. Silas had no answer strong enough to stand between those facts. I didn't know this was here. Tala's eyes hardened. You knew Tag. Yes, you say nothing. That was true. He had opened his door but kept the most important room inside himself locked. Silas looked at the back room where their blankets were folded, at the herbs above the stove, at the third bowl drying beside the sink. He understood how quickly shelter could become another trap when the person offering it controlled the truth. You can take the horse, he said. Both horses if you need them. Mina's eyes filled, but Tala's did not. Tala picked up the ledger. Silas did not stop her. By noon the women had packed everything they owned into 2 blankets. The cold was no longer the reason they were leaving. That made it worse. At the open door, Mina turned back toward the kitchen. Her gaze rested on the loaf she had baked that morning, still warm beneath a cloth. Tala held the ledger under one arm and the brass tag in her fist. Silas stood near the stove. He wanted to tell them that the ranch had been empty before they came, that the silence had returned the moment they packed, that whatever Elias had done, Silas would spend the rest of his life trying to make it right. But apology without truth could become another way of asking the injured person to carry your burden. So he said only, the bay mare is saddled. There's food in the left bag. Tala put her hand on the door, then every horse in the corral raised its head. Riders appeared on the ridge. 7 Apache men came down the slope in a tight line, followed by an older man wrapped in a dark blanket. Behind them rode a white-haired stranger on a mule, his wrists tied to the saddle horn. Mina went pale. Tala stepped in front of her. Silas reached toward the rifle above the door, then stopped. A weapon in his hand would decide too much before anyone spoke. The riders entered the yard. The older man dismounted slowly. He was one of the council members who had supported the widow's removal. He looked at Tala, then Mina. He did not order them home. He lowered his head. The tied stranger on the mule was Voss's interpreter. His face was bruised, not from a beating, but from a hard fall. One sleeve was torn. A leather document case hung from the saddle. The elder spoke. Mina translated in a trembling voice. 3 nights earlier, the interpreter had tried to leave the territory. He carried letters, receipts, and a second ledger. A young rider recognized the Voss Company seal and stopped him near the river crossing. Under questioning, the interpreter admitted the letter used against Tala's and Mina's husbands had been forged. There had never been a confession. There had never been payment from raiders. Their husbands had discovered the stolen supplies being moved toward Copper Ridge. They confronted the freight crew. Silas Reed, Silas's brother, had joined them. All 3 men agreed to carry proof to the agency inspector. They never arrived. The elder removed a folded piece of oilskin from inside his blanket. It contained a page torn from a freight ledger and a short message written in English by Elias. Silas recognized the handwriting before the paper reached him. The message had been meant for Silas. "If I do not make it back, the black book is under the 3rd board in your barn. The women's husbands are not thieves. Voss sold the winter load. We tried to stop him. Tell the truth before the snow does what he could not." Silas read the final line twice. Beneath it were 2 marks witnessed by Elias, one for each husband. The elder continued. The interpreter confessed that Voss's men had ambushed them in the canyon. Elias hid the larger ledger in the freight box and got it to Reed Gate before returning to help the others. He was caught on the trail afterward. The brass tag had been torn from the wagon during the struggle. Tala's husband held it because he believed it could identify the stolen shipment. The 3 men had died trying to bring food back to the people who later believed they had betrayed them. Mina covered her mouth. For months she had carried 2 griefs, that her husband was dead and that perhaps she had never truly known him. Now one of those griefs was gone. The other became heavier. Tala did not cry at first. She stood with the brass tag pressed into her palm until the edge cut her skin. Then she looked at Silas. "Your brother came back here?" Silas nodded toward the floor of the barn, long enough to hide the book. "He went back?" Silas read the message again. "Yes." Elias had not vanished because he was running from what he had done. He had vanished because he returned to finish it. The brother Silas had doubted for 3 years, had carried the truth home and died before anyone opened the right door. The elder stepped toward Tala and Mina. Through Mina's translation, he said the council had acted from fear. They had trusted a paid interpreter over 2 women whose grief made them easy to silence. They had treated uncertainty as guilt because Winter demanded a quick answer. He did not ask them to forget. He asked them to hear an apology. Then he asked them to return. Tala looked past him toward the riders. Some avoided her eyes. One had tears on his face. They were relatives, neighbors, men who had eaten beside her husband and still allowed her to walk into the snow. The camp was part of her. So was the wound. Before she could answer, another sound came from the road, wagon wheels. Harlan Voss arrived in a covered freight wagon with 2 armed guards and a territorial deputy. Voss wore a dark coat too fine for the trail. Mud had dried on his boots, but not enough to hide the shine. He looked first at the interpreter, then at the ledger in Tala's arms. His face changed. The deputy held up a paper and announced that property stolen from the Voss Freight Company was believed to be on Silas Reed's land. He had an order to search the ranch and detain anyone interfering with government freight. Voss spoke before the deputy finished. "That book belongs to my company." Silas stepped into the doorway. For the first time since the riders arrived, he touched the rifle. He did not raise it. He simply removed it from the wall and set it on the porch, out of reach of everyone. "This house won't settle the truth with guns," he said. Voss smiled thinly. "Then step aside." Silas did not. The doorway was narrow. Behind him stood Tala and Mina. Beyond them on the table lay Elias's message. "A roof keeps out the weather. A door tells you what kind of people live under it." Silas looked at the deputy. "You can search, but you'll read before you take." Voss's guards shifted. The Apache riders did not. No one reached for a weapon. The deputy entered alone. For nearly an hour, the cabin became the quietest courtroom the territory would never record. The 2 ledgers were laid side by side. Seal numbers from the missing shipment matched the flour seals under the barn. Receipts from Copper Ridge carried the same dates. Elias's notes named the buyers, the amounts, and the route used to leave the agency road. Voss had sold goods already paid for by the government, then blamed raiders and dead guides for the loss. The deputy's confidence weakened with every page. Voss tried to call Elias a thief. Silas handed over the message. Voss called the interpreter a liar. The interpreter answered that lying was exactly what Voss had paid him to do. Voss called the Apache witnesses unreliable. Then Tala placed the brass tag R17 beside the flower seals and pointed to the matching wagon number in both ledgers. A small piece of metal connected the dead men, the stolen supplies, the hidden box, and the man standing in the doorway. Material truth has a way of making polished words look cheap. The deputy folded the search order. Then he turned it over and wrote a different name on the back. Harlan Voss. There was no gunfight, no heroic charge. Only the dry click of handcuffs closing around a man who had counted on everyone else's fear lasting longer than his paper trail. Voss looked at Silas as the guards, now following the deputy, put him in his own wagon. "You think this makes your brother innocent?" Silas looked toward Tala and Mina. "No," he said. "The truth does." By evening the yard was quiet again. The riders built a small fire near the corral. Food was shared. The interpreter remained tied, waiting to be taken to the agency office with the evidence. Inside the cabin, Tala set the ledger on the table. She and Mina had not unpacked. The elder repeated his invitation. They could return with honor. Their husbands' names would be cleared before the camp. The council would speak the truth publicly. The families who had turned away would be required to hear it. Mina looked at Tala. This time, the choice belonged to them. Tala asked for one night. The elder agreed. After the others slept, Silas sat on the porch steps with Elias's message in his hands. Tala came outside and sat several feet away. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Silas said, "I should have asked about the tag the first night." Tala watched the dark line of the ridge. "You were afraid, yes, so was I." Silas looked at the cabin door. "Fear kept that ledger under the floor for 3 years. Maybe not my fear at first, but afterward, I stopped looking. I let not knowing become easier than finding out." Tala considered this. Then she said, "You opened door. It was not forgiveness. Not yet, but it was true." Silas nodded. "You and Mina made it a home." Tala's eyes moved toward the stable, the repaired fence, the channel carrying water to the trough. "We made work, that too." A faint smile crossed her face and disappeared. She told him she would return to the camp with Mina for the public clearing of their husbands' names. Their families deserved to know. The children who had heard the word traitor deserved to hear a different word, brave. But she did not know whether she could live there again. Silas did not ask her to stay. He had learned that an open door became a trap the moment someone stood in front of it. At dawn, Tala and Mina rode out with the others. The back room was empty. The third bowl remained beside the sink. Silas spent the next 2 weeks giving evidence. The territorial deputy took the ledgers to the agency inspector. Buyers at Copper Ridge confirmed the sales. Voss's own receipt book showed that he had charged the government once and the mining companies again. The total theft covered 3 shipments, not 1. Food meant for more than 100 people had been diverted over 11 months. Elias and the 2 Apache guides had discovered it because one wagon carried the wrong flower seal and because the wheel tracks turned south where no government route went south. Small details, that was how large lies often failed. Voss was removed from the contract and taken east for trial. The interpreter agreed to testify. The agency restored the missing winter allotment, though no replacement shipment could return the months already lost. Silas's brother was formally cleared. So were Tala's and Mina's husbands. Paper could restore a name, it could not restore the person who carried it. At the end of the 2nd week, snow began again. Silas was splitting wood when he heard 2 horses on the ridge. Tala and Mina rode into the yard. Mina carried a bundle of woven blankets. Tala carried nothing but the brass tag. Silas stood beside the chopping block, unable to speak. Mina dismounted first. She walked to the cabin, opened the door, and placed the blankets in the back room. Tala remained near her horse. Silas waited. She said the council had spoken before everyone. The forged letter had been burned. Their husbands' names had been restored. The families who condemned them had offered food, livestock, and a place to live. Mina had chosen to divide her time between the camp and Reed Gate. Her mother was still there. So were children who needed help after the stolen winter supplies. Tala had made a different choice. She held out the brass tag. Silas expected her to return it to him. Instead, she placed it above the doorway, driving a small nail through the torn hole. R17 caught the morning light. "Why there?" Silas asked. "So no one hides it again." Silas looked at the mark left by the wagon that carried a crime, a warning. and the last proof 3 men had died protecting. The tag no longer belonged to Voss. It no longer belonged only to Elias. It belonged to the truth that had finally reached the house. Tala stepped through the doorway. This time she did not pause on the threshold. Spring came late to the high valley. When the ground softened, Talas expanded the water channel and planted beans near the lower fence. Mina began traveling between the camp and the ranch with medicine, letters, and news. Silas rebuilt the old stage room into a bunkhouse. They named the place Open Door Station. It became a stopping point for freight drivers who had no money, families caught between settlements, women traveling alone, and anyone the winter found before shelter did. No one was asked to explain their grief before receiving a meal. No one had to prove innocence before being given a blanket. Above the entrance hung the brass tag R17. Under it, Silas carved a sentence into the lintel: "A roof keeps out the weather. The door stays open." Years later, travelers still told the story of the lonely rancher who found 2 Apache widows on a frozen trail and brought them home. But that was only half the truth. Silas gave them shelter for one night. Tala and Mina gave him back his brother. Together they cleared 3 dead men's names, exposed a theft built on fear, and turned an abandoned ranch into a place where exile ended at the threshold. On the frontier, a home was never just the land beneath your feet. It was the door that did not close when the storm knew your name.